Hello and welcome back to the Cisco CCNP route training from TrainSignal. Again, my name is Joe Reinhardt and I am your instructor. We're actually going to depart from the theoretical technical knowledge and we're actually going to now sort of concentrate on some practical matters. And this is specifically how to prepare to take the CCNP route 642902 exam. Now let me preface this by saying that I've made this very journey myself. I actually did the CCNP back in the year 2000 where they actually required 4 exams, and I've actually stepped through this process, and so I believe that within the bounds of the Cisco non-disclosure agreement I can give you some guidance on the best ways to approach the exam. So in this particular lesson, again, it's going to be very practical. We're going to go through just a final content and topic overview. This is actually going to be a review of the exam blueprint itself, which is the guidelines that you need to follow anyway. A little bit about the test-taking environment. Since you've already done your CCNA, you've been through this, but it's important to be able to understand a little bit about the logistics of just taking the exam itself. It's important also to understand the Cisco confidentiality agreement. We'll go over that. Then we'll talk about just some general test-taking tips for success, just some ways to maximize your time and your success as well. And then finally, specifically, test-taking strategies for these Cisco exams. Okay, one of the things that's obvious is that in each one of the Cisco certifications there's an exam blueprint that actually spells out all the major content. Now it's not exhaustive. There are some topics, questions, and so forth that may appear on exams that aren't in the blueprint, but by following the blueprint you have the best opportunity to maximize your chances for success. And this is the direct CCNP route blueprint. It's things we've gone over all the way through this lesson series, but we want to just be able to take some time to restate it. 1. To be able to implement an EIGRP-based solution giving a network design and set of requirements. The statement given a network design and set of requirements basically appears numerous times in the exam blueprint. Implement a multi-area OSPF network. Same catchphrase. Implement an eBGP-based solution. Notice it doesn't identify IBGP, although there's things about IBGP you are wise to know and understand. Implement an IP version 6 based solution. Implement an IP version 4 or IP version 6 based redistribution solution, given a network design and set of requirements. And then implement a layer 3 path control solution. To be able to drill into each one of these, we'll start with EIGRP. And essentially, it's the same process for each one of the protocols. You determine the network resources needed. You create an implementation plan. You create a verification plan. In other words, what commands and what methodology you're going to use to make certain that you have successfully implemented this particular protocol. Then there's the process of actually configuring its operation, the router, protocol, process ID, ASN, and so forth. The various ways to place interfaces in the routing protocol, passive interface, and so forth. Then verifying using the correct show and debug commands. We actually stepped through this in a number of the lessons, but there are obviously more that you want to be able to take advantage of. And then finally, be able to document the results for an EIGRP implementation. The graphic to the left is one we used during our EIGRP lessons. OSPF, same methodology, same process. Determine network resources. Create an implementation plan, create a verification plan, configure the actual OSPF routing process itself, verify it was implemented using various show and debug commands, and then document those results. Again, graphic to the left, just sort of a snapshot of the way OSPF has formal neighbor relationships. Implement an eBGP-based solution. Network resources, implementation plan, verification plan, routing itself being configured. Remember, BGP acts a little differently. The network statement has a different function in EIGRP, just as an example. And then obviously being able to document that. And the graphic to the left again illustrates some of the things that we talked about for eBGP. Remember, eBGP is neighbors in different autonomous systems appearing on port TCP port 179. IP version 6, which we also dealt with in some depth. Network resources, implementation, verification, routing. Different step here. Configure IP version 6 interoperation with IP version 4. Remember we talked about NAT protocol translation, NAT PT, various tunneling solutions, manually configured tunnels, automatic tunnels, isotap tunnels, 6-to-4 tunnels, dual stack. Those were interoperation solutions. Verify that it was implemented correctly using show and debug commands. Document the verification results. Implement an IP version 4 or IP version 6 base redistribution solution. Remember, redistribution is the process of taking routing information from one protocol and actually importing it into another. And for this particular topic, you can think about static routes, connected routes, and so forth as being another routing process, even though, strictly speaking, they're not a routing protocol. But create a redistribution implementation plan, be able to verify it, configure it, verify it was redistributed correctly, and then document the results. Because you're dealing with multiple protocols, there might be different show and debug commands you'd want to actually take a look at. But remember, usually start with making sure your neighbor relationships and protocols are correct, that you're filtering as needed to make sure that routes are not being imported back into the protocol that were advertised out to begin with, and so forth. And obviously, you also want to be able to look at the differences between implementing the same thing in IP version 4 and IP version 6, because there are differences in how the commands work. Path control. You want to be able to create an implementation plan, verify that plan, configure it, document it, verify it, and so forth. Again, the graphic to the left, we talked about different site types, ways to be able to configure, for instance, PPP over Ethernet, so forth, policy-based routing, and so forth. We also talked about teleworker and branch services, broadband, configuring basic broadband connections, describing VPN technologies. We actually implemented a VPN, configuring GRE, and then just be able to describe the different branch access technologies. Now we want to talk a little bit now about the test-taking environment. The single vendor for testing is Pearson VUE. Now, a number of years ago, Prometric was another vendor, but Cisco simplified the process by implementing just a single vendor for testing purposes. These testing centers for Pearson VUE are located worldwide, and you are able to schedule your exams and such at www.pearsonvue.com. Now, when you schedule your exams, you have a variety of different methods available to you. You can do them online or you can do them by phone. It's been my personal experience that doing it online is easier unless you run into a problem. Then usually you have to resort to making sure that you do it over the phone. You may have to check with several testing centers to get the date you desire. We're going to illustrate that in just a moment. There's a certain amount of availability of certain slots for certain exams depending on the logistics of that particular testing center. Some may not offer the exam that you want, for example, and you may have to drive a little further or go a little further. You have to pay for the exam when you register. You can't just simply say, I'll pay for it later, or any of that sort of logistics. You have to actually pay for it. Or if you have a voucher, which sometimes is provided by an employer or some other mechanism, you can use that when you're registering. For example, if you ever attend the Cisco Live conferences, normally a certification exam is part of the package, and you'll be given a voucher number or a promotion number to put in to actually zero out the cost of the exam. And that's just an example of how that works. Now, the other thing to note is make sure you understand and note whatever the cancellation or inclement weather policy is. Cancellation is if you have to cancel the exam for some reason, you have to do it within a certain period of time, so pay attention to that. Inclement weather policy, you really need to be careful of, because I've had this particular problem myself. When, for instance, Prometric was one of the exam proctors. I had scheduled an exam. There was basically a very big weather event in Seattle, and the testing centers were all closed, so I couldn't go. And I was actually registered as a no-show, even though the testing center had been closed. And I had to get on the phone and spend some time with the staff to be able to get that straightened out. But it's important to be able to navigate that in advance rather than after the fact. Now, when you arrive at the testing center, there's a check-in process. You have to put all your personal belongings in a locked cabinet. Everything's locked up, so it's secure. But you can't have any cell phones, you can't have any devices, you can't have any paper. None of that's allowed in the testing center. If you're caught with any of that, it's considered cheating and you will immediately be discharged from the testing center. You need 2 forms of ID, including a government-issued ID with a photo. This is typically going to be, in the U.S., a driver's license, and then you may have a credit card or something like that that may be able to serve as a secondary ID. Also pay attention to what they consider valid forms of ID. Then you will have your photo taken as you are there. This is to ensure that it's actually you taking the exam, and there will be a signature required as well. Pearson VUE is a secured testing environment. It's monitored at all times, both by audio and by video. There are individual cubicles with workstations for individual testing. That way you have a certain amount of privacy. If it's noisy or you're easily distracted, you can request a set of headphones. And by headphones, I don't mean the kind that you can listen to music with, but the kind that block out noise. Since there's no paper permitted in the testing centers, you are provided with some very small dry erase boards. They're basically laminated pieces of paper that say Pearson VUE on them, and you can use dry erase markers on it. And the dry erase markers are not very fine pointed, so it can be a little bit sloppy, but that's really your only option. You can ask for additional ones if you want. Just some helpful tips about being able to deal with the exam environment, having, again, done this many, many times myself. First, arrive early. If you can, arrive 30 minutes early. Now, if the testing center doesn't open until a specific time and you're one of the first people up, it's still a good idea to arrive early. Have your ID ready. If there's a line for people checking in, go ahead and have all your ID and other things taken care of in advance. If it's a safe enough area, leave phones and such in your vehicle. Obviously, if you're a little more concerned about the surrounding area, and I've been at a few testing centers like this, you may just want to have everything locked up in that way. But eliminating extra distractions and steps is always a good idea. For your wallet, purse, or valuables, they will be safe in the provided lockers. There's a lot of monitoring and security mechanisms there, and the proctor is able to keep charge of and observing where your valuables are. If there's a problem as you're taking your exam, the workstation, for instance, freezes up or does something unforeseen, let the proctor know immediately, because the clock's still ticking. And if something goes wrong and you try to fix it on your own, or you just try to deal with it, and you lose 20 minutes of time or even 10 minutes of time, it can actually cost you your ability to be able to finish the exam. So if there's a problem, let them know right away. I just want to take a moment to explain a little bit about a document called the Cisco Confidentiality Agreement. You've probably seen this before, but it is essential and incredibly important to your success as a certification candidate or certification holder. This is a legal agreement, a binding legal agreement between candidates, those taking exams, and Cisco systems. It's not optional. If you say you don't agree with this confidentiality agreement, for instance, when you're registering, you're not going to be able to register for an exam. It is a hard and fast requirement. The basic purpose is aimed at preventing any cheating in the certification process. The reason why is if just anybody can get it by cheating or other means, it devalues the certification and ultimately ends up cheating those who actually have worked hard to try to achieve them. So it's aimed at being able to prevent that. There are other vendors with certifications that have experienced problems in this area as well, and so it's obviously been included as Cisco's plan for this particular process. Now, here's the basic code of conduct or expectations of any testing candidates: that you're not going to distribute, discuss, or communicate exam information to anyone. This is sometimes called the non-disclosure clause. The basic idea is you're not going to give away information that's going to unfairly aid someone else. You're not going to use fraudulently obtained testing material. There are a number of sites that provide test questions and test answers. You're saying that you're not going to deal with those. Using falsified identification credentials. This is one of the reasons why pictures are taken when the exams are taken. The idea is that you are actually the person taking the exam and that someone else isn't taking it for you. You will also not cause any sort of disturbance in the testing center. You will not take any notes in or any notes out of the testing center. You'll not tamper with the workstation. And this is another important one. You will not misrepresent exam scores or certification achievement. You're not going to walk around saying, I got a 970 on the Cisco CCNP route exam when you got a 700. And even more important, you're not going to say, I have a CCNP certification when you don't. I actually worked with an individual a number of years ago that I shared a cubicle with, and I was called by a Cisco learning partner asking, what my needs were in terms of actually achieving certifications. I had not yet achieved my CCIE, but I actually rattled off the number of ones that I had. I talked about the CCNA, the CCDA, the CCNP, the CCDP, and so forth. And to my surprise, less than 45 minutes later, he was interviewing with another position within the company. He rattled off everything exactly as I had said it, which I knew was not true. Obviously, I was not the person who was going to rat him out, but the point is that doing that or having a record of that could result in a violation of the Cisco confidentiality agreement. And just so you know, the penalty for violating this is exceptionally stiff. It means immediate revocation of all Cisco certification that you may hold. So it's not just that the exam that you took will be invalidated, but everything. Anything that you happen to have at that point would immediately be revoked. And that's a very, very stiff penalty given the amount of work it takes to get these. So please, please take this seriously. So just general test-taking tips for success. This is probably going to apply to a variety of different exam and testing environments, even college classes or university courses and things of that nature. The first thing to do is to make sure that you're prepared. Get plenty of rest the night before. Last-minute cramming is not usually helpful. There's not usually some bit of information. Oh, I'm going to remember the 224005 as being part of protocol number X or Y. That's very seldom going to happen and be helpful. Use legitimate practice exams to test for readiness. Make sure that these are things that can challenge you. A lot of the Cisco press books will come with an exam testing engine, for example, that you can use. Don't be afraid to schedule if you feel you're not ready. I've had this happen a few times myself where I just didn't think that if I went and took the exam that I was going to be able to do well. So if you don't think you're ready, just reschedule it well enough in advance that you're not penalized, but there's no harm in pushing that a little bit if you need it. And then also know the way to the testing center well in advance. If it's your first time being there, you might just want to drive, take a casual drive, figure out where it is, see the building, and then you know exactly how to get there the next time. Instead of being pressed for time, being lost, being late, and then just not being in a good frame of mind when you go to take the exam. Another just general idea of good practice is pace yourself. Figure out how long to spend on questions. If it's a 2-hour exam and you have 70 questions, do the math and figure out on average how long to spend on each question. Now, there will be some questions that you have to spend more time on. The full simulation questions, the Simlet questions, those are going to take a little more time, but multiple answer or single answer, those don't need to take quite as much time. Remember that once you answer a question, you cannot go back. So once you've taken the question and you've answered it, you can't simply go back later. Now, there's a tendency in exams that some of the questions later actually help you answer something that you weren't sure about earlier, but you don't have the option of marking questions to go back. It used to be an option, and then it used to be an option on all exams except the CCIE written exams, and then they changed that as well. So it's pretty much once you've answered it, you're done. And don't panic if you're not sure of the answer. Make a good educated guess, but don't panic. Now, some test-taking strategies specific to Cisco exams. And again, this is within the Cisco confidentiality agreement. I'm not giving you answers. I'm not telling you things that are on the exams, but just some general test-taking strategies with regard specifically to Cisco exams. First, let the exam itself work for you. Some of the questions only require one answer. It will tell you how many answers there are to a particular question. If it's all radio buttons, it's a single answer type question. If there are check boxes, it's almost always going to be a multiple choice answer, and it will tell you how many there are. So some, one answer, some, several answers. Simlets or simulations may require manual input. You may have a simulated command line and you're supposed to type in the syntax of a particular command. In past exams, I've had this very thing as well. And again, you don't have to guess about the number of responses that are required for a question. The exam will tell you. So let the exam do some of the work for you and you don't have to worry about it. Another thing is only guess when you have to. Almost no one ever gets a perfect score. It's just the nature of exams. When you're in doubt, remember the basics. Remember the underlying protocols. For instance, if you're talking about IP, remember that ARP needs to map layer 2 to layer 3 addresses and things of that nature. If you realize what the underlying basics are to something, it can help you reason through a question if you're not 100% sure of the answer. Don't blindly answer or panic. Instead, reason through and use instinct. Typically, when you take an exam, your first impression is going to be your best one. It's not a fail-safe, it's not a guarantee, but it's usually your best guide. If you happen to come up short on exam day, remember failing exam is not the end of the world. I have failed a number of exams in my time, both in formal education and even with certification. Many times when I've gone to recertify my CCIE, I've usually had to take the recertification written exam more than once. And in fact, I took the CCIE exam, lab exam, 5 times before actually passing. So trust me when I say it's not the end of the world. Now, do you want to fail? No. Is it frustrating? Yes, but it's not the end of the world. And you can look at a failed attempt as a dress rehearsal. What were some questions you weren't certain on? What areas did the score report tell you that you didn't do well in? Those are the areas to concentrate on next. So always take even experiences that are negative and make them a positive. If you do have to guess, use a process of elimination on questions. This is true with any types of exams, but it's also particularly true of Cisco exam. One answer is usually absolutely ludicrous, that only an amateur or someone who hadn't studied would pick that particular answer. So if you've gotten that, scratch that off, so to speak, then you're one up. My personal experience has been to take the little dry erase board and actually write A, B, C, D, E for all the possible answers, and then actually go through and eliminate them one at a time. Usually one answer is completely wrong. Eliminate the wrong answers one at a time, reason through, think about the underlying processes and the basics. Realize that 2 answers may sound similar. And if that's the case, read them through and make certain you understand what the difference between the 2 are. Now, they may both be wrong, in which case, more power to you if you've eliminated them, but frequently you'll get down to a couple of answers that sound very, very similar. Select the answer that best matches the question. It may sound counterintuitive at times that what may seem technically more correct may not be the actual answer to the question, so pay attention to that. Pay very, very close attention to wording. Read the question at least twice, and make sure you know what they're asking. Just some key terms to know. Pearson VUE obviously is the official testing vendor for the Cisco Systems certification programs, which usually are called the career certifications. The Cisco Confidentiality Agreement is the legally binding contract between any candidate and Cisco Systems pledging integrity and ethics in the testing process. And then 642902 is the current exam of the Cisco CCNP route exam, one of the 3 exams required for the Cisco CCNP. So what did we cover in this lesson? We talked a little bit about the exam blueprint, the content and topic overview. We reviewed the test-taking environment, how to actually register for the exams. We underscored the importance of understanding the Cisco Confidentiality Agreement, some general test-taking tips for success, and finally, Cisco test-taking strategies. Thank you for your attention, and we will talk to you again in our next lesson.